Hereby, I open the academic ceremony in which Alexandra Katharina Emmendorfer will defend the academic thesis titled Electrophysiological correlates of phonological and temporal regularities in speech processing. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Highly esteemed Prorector and members of the opposition, dear colleagues, family, and friends, thank you for joining me today, either online or in person, as I defend the product of my work over the last 4 years. In the next 15 minutes, I'd like to give you a brief summary of my thesis entitled Electrophysiological Correlates of Phonological and Temporal Regularities in Speech Processing. Speech is a complex acoustic signal that's made up of changes in air pressure over time. And yet we're able to extract meaning from the signal with seemingly little effort. One principle that's thought to contribute to this effortless processing is the idea that we're able to make predictions about upcoming speech based on our prior knowledge. So to illustrate this, I'd like to use the example of this presentation. Depending on whether you're an expert in the field, whether you've read my thesis, whether you've seen me present over the years, or you just have a vague idea of what I do based on some conversations we've had, it might be more or less easy for you to follow along today. But aside from the knowledge of these broad concepts that we're going to be discussing today, everyone who's watching likely has at least some knowledge of the English language. So your knowledge of English and your experience using the language can also allow you to anticipate more specific details of upcoming speech. For example, if I start off by saying, "Good afternoon, ladies and," you'd likely expect the next word to be gentlemen, and you'd be somewhat surprised or confused if I said waffles instead. But you can zoom in even farther, as I did during my PhD, where I studied regularities that occur within individual words, namely speech sound regularities and syllable stress patterns. And my mouse is not where, there it is, sorry. And to do this, I use made-up words, which are called pseudo-words. These are combinations of speech sounds that sound like they could be words, but they actually carry no meaning. And even though we've never heard these pseudo-words before, we can actually make predictions about them based on regularities that we've learned through processes called statistical learning. So in any given language, there are certain combinations of speech sounds that are more likely to occur than others. For example, in Dutch, the combination TS is much more common than the combination TK. So you could say that the pseudo word notzal is more regular than the pseudo word notkal. Another characteristic of speech is the alternation between strong and weak or stressed and unstressed syllables. And in any given language, again, there might be certain stress patterns that are more likely to occur than others. So for example, in Dutch, first syllable stress is more common than second syllable stress. So again, you could say that the pseudo word notzal has a more regular stress rhythm compared to the pseudo word notzal. But why do we focus on these very specific details in speech? These regularities are interesting because they're thought to be important factors in developing successful reading skills. Evidence suggests that individuals with dyslexia don't develop the same sensitivity to these features as typical readers do. And while some studies have looked into how these regularities influence speech processing individually, they vary simultaneously in everyday speech. So therefore, it's interesting to understand better how these work together to contribute to speech processing, so then we can also understand what's happening in children who later go on to develop reading difficulties. The predictions that I've introduced today can be broadly classed into two groups. Predictions about the content of upcoming speech, such as speech sound combinations, I refer to as formal predictions. While predictions about the timing of events in speech, such as the placement of syllable stress, I refer to as temporal predictions. And we can see effects of these predictions in brain activity. So during my PhD, I used EEG to measure brain activity. This is a non-invasive method of recording the electrical activity from neurons that are firing within the brain from electrodes that are placed on the scalp. And in a range of different experiments, one pattern that's commonly observed is reduced brain activity for predictable input, suggesting that what the brain is really representing is the mismatch between the predicted and the actual input. So this can be seen, for example, in experiments where sentences end in predicted or unpredicted words, such as the example I gave before. So we would expect to see more brain activity in response to the unexpected word waffles compared to the expected word gentleman. Similar patterns can also be seen when we're comparing situations where the timing of an event can be anticipated based on the timing of previous events to situations where this is not possible. So in my PhD, I used two different EEG paradigms to study how these regularities in speech sound combinations and syllable stress patterns contribute to speech perception. The first type of paradigm that I use is called an oddball paradigm. So here the participant listens to a sequence of words or sequence of stimuli where there's one frequently occurring stimulus represented here in gray, and one or more less frequently occurring stimuli represented here in yellow and green. And in my case, the stimuli are pseudo words that vary in speech sound and syllable stress regularities. Now, when comparing the stimuli that are presented as the standard and as the deviant, one thing that we can see is greater negativity in the deviant trials compared to the standard trials. This is called the mismatch negativity. And this is a marker of how easily the brain can tell the difference between the two sounds. So if it's easy to tell the difference, the mismatch negativity will be fast and large. If it's difficult to tell the difference, the mismatch negativity will be slow and small. And there are two aspects of this component that are particularly interesting for our research. First, it's experience dependent, which means that the size and timing of the mismatch negativity reflect our knowledge of the world. Second, it's elicited even if we're not directly paying attention to these features. And this is particularly important because a lot of the knowledge that we have about language is implicit, and otherwise task demands might confound our observations. Another measure that we can see in the EEG signal are brain oscillations. And these can give us an idea of how well or what type of dynamics are underlying the mismatch negativity. The measure that I'm going to be presenting today is called intertrial coherence, which looks at how well aligned the brain activity is across trials. We know that oscillations tend to align when a stimulus is presented, and that this alignment is typically increased when a deviant stimulus is presented. So in this study, we aim to test whether variations in speech sound and syllable stress regularities interactively change brain activity, as measured by the mismatch negativity and oscillations, and whether we can see differences between dyslexic and typical readers. I'm going to give a brief schematic overview of the findings from the oddball paradigm, with the measures of interest being the mismatch negativity timing, mismatch negativity strength, and the brain oscillations. So starting with the speech sound regularities, the first thing that we see is that we have an earlier mismatch negativity for the more typical, more regular speech sound combinations, which is in line with our idea that these are processed more easily. Interestingly, there's no difference between the regular and irregular patterns in the dyslexic individuals that we tested. The size of the mismatch negativity component, on the other hand, does not differ across stimuli or reading ability. And this is interesting given that previous research found this effect of speech sound regularities actually to be on the mismatch negativity size, not on the timing. The reason that we see these different effects here is likely due to the fact that previous research only manipulated the speech sound regularities, where we're also varying the syllable stress patterns. For syllable stress, looking at the oscillations, we see an increase in alignment for the deviants that are differing in speech sounds. And interestingly, this was actually larger in the dyslexic group, which might be related to some kind of attentional effect where the dyslexic participants might have been more distracted by the unexpected stimulus. For the syllable stress regularities, we don't see any modulation of the mismatch negativity in the strength or the timing by variations in syllable stress, as well as no group differences. And this suggests that while both typical and dyslexic readers can hear the difference between first and second syllable stress, there's no facilitated processing of regular or irregular stress patterns at this level of processing, and also no disadvantage for dyslexic readers. When we look into the oscillations here, what's striking is that instead of the increased alignment, we see actually a decrease in alignment and for the deviance relative to standards. And here this suggests that the change in syllable stress pattern actually disrupts the tracking of the very repetitive speech within a block. So far, I've talked about predictions that are made while listening to speech, but you in the audience aren't the only ones who are currently predicting what I'm going to say next. In fact, I'm also making predictions about the words and the sounds that are coming out of my mouth. And this can allow me to then catch and correct errors faster than if I was just listening to a recording of this talk. This type of prediction about the sensory consequences of our own actions can also allow us to distinguish between sensations that we generate ourselves and those that are generated externally. This is also observed in brain activity, where we see reduced brain activity for self-produced sensations. This phenomenon is called motor-induced suppression and is also thought to be the reason why we can't tickle ourselves. So to study whether regularities in speech sound and syllable stress patterns might shape predictions we make during speech production, I use what's called a motor to auditory paradigm. Here, we compare the brain activity in trials where the participant presses a button to trigger the presentation of a pseudo word to trials where the participant passively listens to them. And we focus on the measures N1 and P2, which are commonly associated with auditory processing. And specifically, these components are also those where we typically see motor-induced suppression, meaning a smaller amplitude in response to the sounds that are self-triggered versus those that are externally presented. So moving to the results, where we're going to look at the amplitude or the strength of the N1 and P2. First, we see an interaction between condition, which is represented here with the solid or dotted lines, and the speech sound regularities, represented here by red and black lines. And this suggests that the speech sound regularities are processed differently depending on whether they're self-produced or externally generated. Looking into the conditions to see specifically what these effects are, we didn't actually see any significant effects in either condition, but there's a small trend towards an effect in the motor auditory condition, which hints that this feature might be given more weight during speech production. So I want to stress that this isn't a very big effect, but it's still something that that's interesting and is worth possibly future follow-up studies. We don't see any modulation on the P2 strength. Now for syllable stress, there were no effects on the N1 strength. However, we do see a significant effect of syllable stress on the P2 strength, with more activity for the first syllable stress items. As this was the same in both conditions, and based on the timing of this component also likely reflects the processing of just the first syllable, this is most likely just driven by acoustic differences. So intensity or loudness is one marker of syllable stress. So in words with first syllable stress, the first syllable is actually louder. So now I've listed a bunch of results and I've shown you some schematics, but I want to summarize them now into 3 key findings. First, speech sound regularities shape speech perception. The strongest evidence for this comes from chapters 2 and 3, where I showed that more predictable items are processed faster, but only in typical readers. Second, in Dutch speakers, variations in syllable stress patterns don't appear to influence processing at this level of processing in individual pseudo-words. So the only effect of syllable stress that I saw in any of the chapters was this effect on the P2 amplitude, which is likely driven by acoustic differences. Now, this doesn't mean that Dutch speakers don't hear the difference between first and second syllable stress. The fact that we do see a mismatch negativity and this effect on the P2 suggests that they do hear the difference. It just means that at this level of speech processing, there's no facilitated effect for more typical items. And finally, when we're looking at individual pseudo words, speech sound and syllable stress regularities are processed separately and do not interact. This is based on the fact that we don't see any interactions between these two features in any of the chapters. Additionally, the different modulations in the brain oscillations that we see in chapter 3 suggest that there are different brain dynamics involved in distinguishing between syllable stress combination, speech sound combinations, and first and second syllable stress. So to conclude, in my PhD research, I've used EEG to show that regularities influence how we process speech and that different types of regularities are processed differently. My results indicate somewhat different patterns compared to previous studies that investigated speech sound regularities and syllable stress in isolation. But these different results might therefore indicate that on the one hand, syllable stress does influence the processing of speech sound combinations to some extent, even if we don't see a clear interaction. And additionally, a lot of the studies that investigate syllable stress regularities are conducted in different languages, such as Hungarian or Finnish, that have different rules for how we can use these stress patterns. So this highlights that there's a need for some cross-linguistic approach to better characterize these patterns across languages. And finally, I've also shown that adults with dyslexia do not seem to show the same sensitivity to speech sound regularities as typical readers do, supporting our idea that there's a relationship to reading development. So future research should look into how we process these regularities across development so we can deepen our understanding of their relationship to reading skills. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. According to the clock, 30 seconds before the 15 minutes. So there's an extremely timely and smooth presentation. Thank you for that. And now the opposition will be opened by Professor Zak.
Yes, thank you, Paul Rector. Dear candidate, First of all, my compliments for a very good and solid PhD thesis. Also, my compliments for the supervisors, of course. It was very enjoyable to read, especially was very clearly written, so it was very easy also for a non-expert to understand what you found and what you did not find. So we're also not trying to hide anything of unexpected results, which I very much appreciated. And also the presentation was very clear. So thank you for this. I would like to kick off your defense and my opposition with having your paranym read out one of the propositions. Proposition number 5, please.
Good science takes time. Pilot data from adapted EEG paradigms should be carefully inspected to resolve possible design issues before collecting a full data set.
Yes, thank you. This is so true.
Yeah.
And I've experienced this myself in our lab many times. The question is always, how long do you pilot? When do you give up? When do you move on? But I was wondering what drives a PhD candidate to put this in her 10 propositions or so. So my question probably is, what do you mean? Do you mean that your thesis is so great because you took the time to pilot sufficiently, or because this is the lesson that you learned after you finished your thesis? Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your question. I'm very happy that you've asked this question, and I'd be very happy to elaborate on this. It's a lesson that I learned during the thesis. So in chapter 4 specifically, I think this is where I encountered this issue, where I also then had these unexpected results that you referred to. And yeah, I think that if I had spent basically more time piloting different variations of this experiment, also looking more thoroughly into the data at the time, I could have, avoided some of the problems that cropped up in the end in this chapter. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So it was more lesson learned, and so very good for you to put it in the proposition.
Yeah.
Speaking about unexpected results, though, I would like to move now to chapter 2 and also partly chapter 3. I like your approach very much, having the pseudo words and this passive oddball paradigm, and this attempt to vary actually two features, the formal and the temporal prediction, and you refer also to previous work. So the idea to use this in the context of mismatch negativity as a marker of change detection is not new. This has been done before, but your innovation is to put them all intermixed into one design, and that has not been done before. And I assume you did this because you expected some sort of interaction between these two factors, but you didn't find that. So, and I couldn't really read in your thesis your theoretical motivation behind this interaction, and also an explanation why you didn't find it. Could you tell me a bit more about this? Why you went for an interaction?
Yeah, so we wanted to look to see whether we would find an interaction between these features, because on the one hand, in everyday speech, of course, they do vary together. And so it would make sense that one of the features influences how we process the other kind of just intuitively. Additionally, we also know from previous research that individuals with dyslexia tend to be have possibly reduced sensitivity to either of these or both of these, and this can vary depending on the individual, depending on the language. And so I guess, we wanted to see, testing these two features together, whether we then see that there's an interaction of some kind. We don't see an interaction, and I guess we have a couple explanations or ideas for why this might be the case. So on the one hand, these are pseudo words, right? They're not real words, they carry no meaning. And so if we think about the way that syllable stress is used in Dutch, it can sometimes basically distinguish between words. I actually now can't think of an example in Dutch, but for example, in English, present as in a gift versus present, to give a presentation. These are two words that differ only in the syllable stress, and that can change the meaning of the word then. And when we have pseudo words, of course, there's no meaning. So it doesn't there's no reason for the stress to be relevant, I guess, in that sense. And I would assume that possibly if we looked into a different type of paradigm. So rather than these like individual pseudo words that we're presenting, but maybe something with continuous speech, maybe something with real words or sentences or something, then we might see an interaction. But I think at this level of processing with individual pseudo words, yeah, it's not, at least in Dutch speakers, they don't seem to influence each other. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Even though you didn't find an interaction, and I think you gave a very good explanation for why that may be, and also ideas even for future design changes that could still find those interactions, that makes sense because it varies in a natural context, of course. You did have interesting results. You found the effect or mismatch negativity for the phonotactic probability condition, similar to what has been found before. It's always good to replicate previous findings, but there's one aspect that didn't really replicate, and that is what exactly you found to be modulated in the mismatch negativity. Whereas your previous research, including work from your own supervisor team, found really effects on the amplitude, which you also hypothesized, therefore. Your effects are mainly on the latency.
Yeah.
And then you explain, and I follow you completely because your writing is so good, that they could both be just a facilitator of change detection. You know, so change detection can materialize in a quicker mismatch negativity or in a stronger. That makes sense. But I was still wondering why you think that Ponte found effect on amplitude and you on latency, and isn't there also a difference in terms of neural processes, or even maybe a fundamental different mechanism also related to maybe atypical speech perception that could be marked by those two different effects?
Yeah. So I think what we're thinking, or the reason why we think that we see it here in the latency and not in the amplitude, is so possibly because we're varying syllable stress. So even if there's not a clear interaction, it might be that the brain is in a different mode because both of these features are being manipulated. I think it might also be somewhat related to acoustic differences. So in the second syllable stress items, basically at the transition between the syllable, there we have this, for the low phonotactic probability, we have this plosive, the k, so we have the t, we have two plosives following each other. And I think that possibly, so we saw in the standards for the low phonotactic probability items, basically a little kind of double peak around the mismatch negativity window, which is not as strong in the high phonotactic probability items because we don't have those two plosives there. And so I think that somehow this different morphology in the EEG, in the ERP waveform, might have somewhat shifted a little bit to the latency of the effects that we're seeing. And then especially because in the second syllable items, this is even more enhanced because it's like there's the stresses, including the k sound, that might have changed a little bit of the results that we're seeing there. So yeah, I would say either it's because the brain is in a different mindset, or it's because of these small acoustic differences, or probably a mix of both. But then the second part of your question was whether this might relate to different mechanisms, and that might be, differently relevant for atypical processing. And I guess that's certainly a possibility. So we've interpreted them, as both kind of markers of facilitated change detection. And I think in Milena's papers, she interprets this kind of as a marker of Hebbian learning. So because these cells that fire together, wire together, these sounds occur more often, this memory trace is more stable, so it's activated more easily. And you could say that possibly this is also the case for the latency effect, but there could be a slightly different mechanism. I guess I don't have a strong hypothesis on what that mechanism might be, though.
So maybe just a final question. So if you would have used a design where you used the stimuli just with a phonotactic manipulation, you would expect it to find an effect on the amplitude like Ponte did?
Yeah, I would expect, that's what I would expect then, yeah.
Were you tempted to pilot this maybe? Or?
I would be very happy to pilot that, yes.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zak. I would like now to give the word to Professor Valeria Schepe, who has a chair in cognitive psychology and neuroscience at the research network and focused on brain imaging. I think I'm not saying this completely correctly, in Hungary. Professor Schepe, you have the word.
Thank you very much, dear candidate. I read your dissertation with particular pleasure and also with deep interest, especially because during the last decade, we paid a particular attention to the processing of stress parameters on the word level. And it's very clear, well written, and all the methods and models, your suggestions are based on, speak for a state-of-the-art knowledge in the field. It's very important, especially because for us, another language, having a different type of assigning syllabic stress, and it's very important from the point of view of a general model on word stress level processing. So if I start with the propositions, I combine the 5 and 8. And the 5 is about to resolve the possible design issues before collecting a full data set in my interpretation. And in the 8, they include a cross-linguistic perspective to account for the diversity of human languages. And I have to add to not only for theories, but for interpreting your results as well. So my question goes in this direction first, because Dutch, like English, although there are significant differences, is about that stress does not occur in fixed position with respect to word boundaries, and therefore available as a potential determinant of word identity. So the languages you refer to in your dissertation, Finnish and Hungarian, they do not have lexical stress. And it's a big difference. So the question is whether there is an interaction between lexical stress and the rule what languages uses for stress assignment. It's a very, very important distinction. And for this distinction, would be very important to study words as well, because on the pseudoword level, there are a lot of phenomena you can't study actually. So how they interact, what is the role of this type of stress assignment. So what you deal with in Dutch, and it's not the same for Finnish and Hungarian, there are rules and roles. So what are the rules you use and what is the role of stress and the stress pattern? It's very, very important. So from this point of view, it's very important to take into account that temporal prediction is not the only processing type that you use. And I'm pretty sure you can't study everything when you choose pseudowords. How do we know where the stress should be? And this is the problem in English, and this is the problem in other languages. So you refer to the study of Hatice and Zora, who happened to have me as an opponent as well in 2016. So, and comparing English, Turkish, and Swedish. So if you go further with these studies, I suggest to take into account the phonemic status, the quantity sensitivity, the source of provenance, and the isochrony, what is actually in several languages, stress time, and other languages is syllable time. So that's here you deal with syllable time, or you have a stress time language. So this is a very important issue. So my question is, how would you take into account the main models your conclusion would rely on? Because stress is not just a temporal prediction. And this prediction, according to our data, is processing the auditory dorsal stream is responsible for in the superior temporal gyrus. So the question is, how would you design your next experiment, not just focusing on pseudo words, because I'm pretty sure it wouldn't take you further. So the comparison for word and pseudo word processing. That is my first question, maybe too long with the comments, but it's very important to have a distinction between these languages, what you have data available in the literature.
Because the audio is sometimes not great. The question is how I would design a study that could take into account pseudo words, but also real words. And okay.
And the interaction of lexical.
And the interaction.
Yeah.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your question. So I have to think about that for a moment. I guess, yeah, there have been the mismatch negativity studies that have used then basically real words also with first or second syllable stress, comparing this. And so that's one adaptation that one could do to basically, yeah, compare the roles of phonotactic probability and syllable stress in real words. We considered that at some point at the beginning, but then decided to step away from that because when you're looking at real words, you also have the issue that there might be some correlation between phonotactic probability and word frequency, for example, so then these couldn't be quite separated. Also, you always have the aspect that it has added meaning, of course. And then if we have like the first versus second syllable stress item, if we use words that are basically the same words but only differ in where the syllable stress is placed, these also change the meaning. This also changes, yeah, possibly the word frequency. In Dutch, many words that have second syllable stress, the first syllable is then a prefix. It's a different morpheme. So whether you have one or two morphemes in that word, that could influence the results. So in a sense, because we were mostly interested in these sublexical features, that's also then why we stuck with pseudo words. And I guess, yeah, if I designed a study that used real words, I think we would see very different results then also. So for example, if we used words that have, where the word carries first syllable stress, and then we changed the placement of the syllable stress, so it was then on the second syllable. Here, this would then almost be like a violation then in the end. So there we might then expect like a larger amplitude for the violating pattern of the yeah, incorrect stress placement, I guess. But yeah, I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, but I think, yeah, there are possibilities for looking into using real words, yes.
Thank you. I go a little bit further with, because phonotactic is actually a form of statistical learning, and word stress processing or syllabic stress processing is different. It's in several languages a rule application, And there is an interaction, so you mentioned meaning on the word level. And even in the Illinen study you were referring to in your dissertation, found the difference in a regular stress language, a difference between the pseudo-word and word processing. And this, interestingly enough, in adults, this processing overrules the effect, the impact of violation. The question is whether the same is valid for Dutch, where the stress patterns, where the fixed position does not occur with respect to word boundaries. And there is the regularity, and probability is very important. Would you expect differences for this between children and adults?
And I will give you the word briefly,
Okay.
and then I will have to end this interesting conversation that is, of course, in an unsatisfying manner interrupted by the constraints of time. But please give a brief answer.
Thank you. Yes, I would expect to give a brief answer. Yes, I would expect differences in children and results, children and adults. And in a language such as Dutch, I expect that children would probably pay more attention to these cues because basically they're still, depending on the age of the children, they're still learning words, and so would rely more possibly on stress patterns, for example, to extract words from the speech signal. That would be my brief answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the brief answer, and thank you, Professor Schepe, for your questions. I would like now to give the word to Dr. Lallier, who's a staff scientist at the Basque Center on Brain, Cognition and Language in San Sebastian in Spain. You have the word.
Thank you very much, dear candidate. So first of all, I'd like to congratulate you for your manuscript and your presentation. So I can reiterate that was very, very clear, and I really enjoyed reading your manuscript, and your presentation this morning was really, really clear and very visual. So even from far away, that was very nice to see. And I also very much appreciated your general discussion because you really tried, you can see the effort of trying to integrate everything into a same perspective, you know, trying to bond together your results across your experiments. So that was really nice. So, so my first question would be about, so your study with dyslexic adults, where you found this effect on the effect of phonotactic probability on the latency of MMN, so group difference on that. But it seemed that it's quite a weak effect. I don't know what you think about this. And still you say in your discussion that you think that the sensitivity to phonotactic regularities may play an important role for reading acquisition. So I would like you to elaborate a little bit on this, on why these regularities might be very important. And then I'll go to my second questions.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your questions. So yeah, indeed, in chapter 3, we see basically a small effect, or I think the interaction actually between group and phonotactic probability was not significant. However, when we did post hoc tests, because we had strong hypotheses about what we should expect, we see that there is this effect in the typical readers, but not in the dyslexic readers. And yeah, it's a small effect, and yet we're still saying that it's an important factor in reading development. The reason why, or I think the reason why this effect is so small in this data set is because of the dyslexic readers that we've chosen. So we recruited from within the university, because also we had recruited our control sample from within the university. And this was, yeah, in an aim to kind of match the education level of the participants. And again, if I could go back and pilot again or something, then I would probably adjust how I then recruit so that I could take, make sure to sample across a broader distribution or a broader population. And so because these are dyslexic individuals from the university community, they likely have more reading experience than dyslexic readers who do not go on to university. They likely have developed strategies to, become more fluent in reading. And also it's possible that a lot of these dyslexic readers that we've recruited basically didn't initially receive a diagnosis in elementary school, but rather later on, which means that during elementary school, they were probably just above the cutoff, did not receive an official dyslexia diagnosis, and then later on received a diagnosis during high school or middle school. Which doesn't mean that they don't have reading difficulties, of course. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't, receive accommodations to help with their reading difficulties. But it means that probably if we look at the distribution of dyslexic readers, they're probably on the slightly more proficiently reading side. And I think this is probably why we don't see a strong difference here. We did not see any correlation with the reading scores. So that's also somewhat, unexpected, and I think can possibly be explained by the same reason. I think if we sampled across a broader distribution, then hopefully this result would then be a bit more robust, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so from what I understand is that your first a priori hypothesis was that the sensitivity to phonotactic probabilities would be related to a core deficit in dyslexia, such as the phonological deficit. Is that, yeah? So my question now is, based on this effect and this weak effect and your population, as you really clearly now described, what do you think? Do you think this effect actually relates to something that is the core deficit in dyslexia, or rather something that is a mere consequence of a reading, a lack of reading experience? Because you mentioned there were university students, but maybe even if you're a university student, you still have less reading experience because you read less overall, So, and you didn't show any, cognitive skills related to phonological process, phonological performance, pseudo word reading. So you can't really characterize your population in that sense. So I wanted to know whether you think these effects you find on phonotactic sensitivity may actually just be, a consequence of these people reading less well, but nothing to do with a causal phonological deficit in dyslexia. I would like to know a little bit more what you think about that.
I guess the short answer would be that I don't think our data can answer that question because, we didn't test for these skills specifically. And I guess I can still think about what I think about that. That would be, I think that's something that we would need to investigate a bit further to really say specifically whether this is just a consequence of less reading or a core deficit. I think I would want to test further before answering that question.
Okay, so it's like you had a tapping.
I think I need to interrupt the
Okay.
conversation in the interest of the two last members of the opposition. But thank you very much for your questions, Professor Lallier, and for your answers, dear candidate. I would like to have the opposition continued by Dr. Schwartz, who is an assistant professor at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, thank you for a very interesting presentation, clear presentation, but of course also for a thesis that really was a pleasure to read, I have to say. Providing clear motivation. Clear motivation for your work, and also the willingness to really go into depth in terms of the methods that you applied. So you looked at various ERP components, at behavioral data, you looked at time frequency data, and also didn't hide the difficulties that are associated with such an approach. And I would like to come back with my questions to some of these aspects about the motivation and also the specificity of some of the results. I mean, of course, part of the work, or a major part of the work, is motivated by dyslexia, which is classically considered, of course, a reading disability. You chose to use auditory stimulation, and there is a lot of work on the relation between, or ideas on the relation between the visual aspect of the reading and why these persons should have disability in the auditory domain. So that's one aspect, and the other being one of the factors that you mentioned as underlying this disability is a general statistical learning impairment. And related to the specificity, first, I would like to ask whether anything is known more about whether this general statistical learning disabilities shows in different contexts beyond the language impairment, and how this potentially could inform research into that potentially specific disability.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your question. So your question is about whether there's a general statistical learning deficit in dyslexia and whether there's research on this or research that shows this. I know that there is ongoing research on this, but yeah, I've seen basically some also recent, I think, review papers that are kind of arguing that it might not be a specific statistical learning deficit. I think there are really varied results. And a lot of it then also comes down to task demands, which in statistical learning typically is a passive task, and then it's like a recognition or something like this in the end. And yeah, I think it's something that it requires further investigations. I think that yeah, I guess to give a brief answer, possibly, but I'm not sure entirely, I'd say.
Okay. Yes, so because I was wondering, okay, what is really the link between this visual impairment and the auditory testing that you perform? So right. What is the common denominator?
I see. I mean, so the link, yeah, there are different hypotheses of dyslexia, whether it's a visual deficit, auditory deficit, temporal deficit, different types of deficits. And I guess the idea behind looking into the auditory domain is that individuals with dyslexia might have less robust phonological representations, which are also somewhat related to statistical learning ability. So being able to, yeah, have a sensitivity to features in the speech signal can then allow you more easily to, yeah, extract phonological representations or form phonological representations, and that these kind of less robust phonological representations are then more difficult to pair to the visual symbols, the graphemes. And so I guess that would be where the link is there. But as you say, indeed, we don't use visual stimulation in our experiments. We did have a reading test, like a word reading test. So these were real words, not pseudo words. And that's the extent of our visual stimulation in the dyslexic group. Yeah.
Yeah, and a bit more about specificity then maybe, and that's an aspect that has been mentioned already, also about language specificity. I mean, here we're talking about the language where we have a very close phoneme-grapheme correspondence. We have an auditory paradigm. Would your results, would you expect, that's of course a hypothetical question, but would you expect your results to hold true beyond the auditory domain, go into the visual domain, or also in a different language context?
not so basically if we did like a visual mismatch, kind of like that. That's a good question. I think I wouldn't necessarily expect it to see the same facilitation in the visual domain, like if we did like a visual mismatch negativity. And your other question was across languages. There I would, so a lot of these studies that look at phonotactic probability, or I think most of the ones that I'm aware of were conducted in Dutch. So of course we don't necessarily know, or we don't have the data at this point in time to say that it would be the same in other languages. But I would expect that those results would generalize to other languages if they're really about phonotactic probability. If they're not about phonotactic probability, then probably they wouldn't generalize, but I would expect them to, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then one question, of course, I'm personally very interested in the differentiation between formal and temporal structure and their interaction potentially. But one that came to my mind is the one is related to the time scale that you chose and motivate, of course, well, for your violation, deviation, and temporal structure. So here it's about speech rhythm, and that's a particular syllable-related phenomenon. But there is, of course, a lot of work, also already existing work, basically saying that these persons primarily have a problem with really rapidly changing features. So temporal structure on the phoneme level, indeed. So I was wondering if you could provide a bit more on the motivation to really look at speech rhythm here. What's the driving factor?
Yeah, indeed. So yeah, there are different, I guess, hypotheses on which time scale has a deficit in dyslexia, whether it's the more fine-grained temporal structure of speech or the coarser or larger temporal structure. And so we were kind of motivated by the temporal sampling hypothesis from Usha Goswami to look into basically the syllable level rhythm, so the first versus second syllable stress, because there the idea is that the underlying deficit would be in the slower rhythm, so around the theta frequency. And so that's why then we selected for this syllable stress manipulation. And the idea also from that hypothesis is then because there's a deficit in the slow temporal resolution, that stronger weight is then given to the more high frequency aspects of speech. And so to come back, could you repeat what exactly your question was?
The motivation for really looking at the rhythmic level.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, we wanted to look at the rhythmic level based on this temporal sampling hypothesis from Usha Goswami. But yeah, there are basically different ideas and different results that show kind of different patterns of where this deficit might actually be, given that this hadn't been investigated much in Dutch so far. We wanted to have a look there. Yeah.
I think I have to abruptly end also this interesting conversation. So thank you, Schwartz, for your questions. I would like to give to have associate professor at Maastricht University, Jongman, the word for the final round of questioning.
Yes, thank you. Dear candidate, I also want to compliment you with the nice work and also the promotion team with this nice thesis. I enjoyed reading it. I learned from it. Language is not my natural field of research, but ERPs are. So I'm still able to ask you some questions. But I learned a lot of new things, so that's good always. And also I liked your critical general discussion in which you didn't shy away from criticizing your own work, as you told before, and also mentioning some kind of design problems with this. So yeah, that's good to read, but I will go fastly to my questions because of time. So yeah, I first wanted to ask you something about something you wrote in the introduction. At page 21 in the neural oscillation paragraph.
Yes.
you write, while ERPs can give simple and intuitive insights into predictive processing, with overall patterns suggesting reduced neural activation, more efficient processing for predictable events, they do not tell us much about the underlying mechanisms that lead to these different outcomes. I was a little bit surprised by this statement, and because it suggests later on that oscillations would be better in giving these functional interpretations of the data. And I wondered, yeah, can you comment a little bit on this? Is it your thought or? Yeah.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your question. Yeah, so indeed, so I've said that ERPs give a nice and intuitive and simple insight into what's happening, but that oscillations can tell us a bit more. So the reason or why I think this is the case is because ERPs, yeah, they're very limited in what they can show us. So we can only see effects in the ERPs if it's time locked and phase locked to yeah, to an event that is occurring or event of interest. And you could have many different oscillatory patterns underlying kind of the same ERP manipulation, basically. And so while we can say in ERPs that yes, here there's more activity, there's less activity, there's negative activity, there's positive activity, it's early, it's late, something like this. If we look into the oscillatory domain, then we can kind of see a bit better, yeah, what types of mechanisms are underlying these processes that we're seeing. So we can see if this is something, and then there for different frequency ranges, we have different ideas of what these do. For alpha, for theta, for beta, all have kind of different proposed functions, and this can give us a bit of a better idea of what the brain is actually doing when we see ERP manipulations.
Okay, but yeah, I think I would not agree with this. But do you not think that both are as strongly related to the task paradigms and the experimental manipulations that you do, and how good they are to be able at all to functionally interpret brain activation during cognitive performance?
I agree that they're both certainly valuable and yeah, related to the task that we're doing, to the features that we're studying. So yeah, I guess I would agree with you. Yes.
Okay, because yeah, a few pages back, you also wrote that there's a very rich history of ERP research, right, giving us a good context. So I found this a little bit contradictory, but I'm glad to hear that you agree on this point. Then I have a more specific question about the ERPs in chapter 2, at page 40. With the 3 average ERPs, so you there show the grand averages in the different conditions. It's quite specific, but maybe that's nice to go into the data a little bit more specific. So, but what I see there, especially, is that in the TD, had a temporal deviant condition. The green lines, they are morphology. If you look at the morphology, it's quite different. It's very different from the standard and the deviance in the other condition. Do you have any idea why?
Yeah, so the green lines, these are the temporal deviants, which means that they differ from the standard in terms of syllable stress. And so that also means that the envelope of the stimuli is very different from the standard then. So for the intensity, loudness is one of the markers of syllable stress, and we know that intensity is typically related to ERP amplitude, for example, in the N1, P2, for example. And so we would expect, based on that, to see, yeah, a different morphology simply based on the different envelopes of the.
But does that not also count in the other conditions, because there's also the stress mixed with the.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Is it not also the case in the other conditions, because there's also the stress? Yeah, so
yeah, that's
particularly
true.
In these 2 bottom graphs, you see a quite particular ERP pattern.
Yeah, so I think this is, so yes, exactly. So what we're seeing here, the green is the temporal deviance, and if we compare it to the black line, which is the standard, in these plots here, these are different stimuli. So first versus second syllable stress, for example, for the standard or the deviant, whereas in the plots on page 41, these are the same stimuli that we're showing together. And I guess here what we see is actually quite in line with what Professor Chepe also observes in the studies comparing basically the different stimuli to each other, because we see for the oh wait, no, that's not what we see. Sorry, but basically we see the we see a mismatch negativity.
It looks quite noisy, I must say, in the two bottom. Were there fewer trials, or what happened there?
So which ones look quite
the
noisy?
two bottom pictures with the
Right,
first
so-
syllable, it's exactly the same, like HPP and LPP, but with the first syllable stress. Especially these green lines, these ERPs look really atypical after the 200 milliseconds compared to the other ones, I must say.
Right. Well, so if we can look at the bottom one, I'm going to look at the bottom left one. So where the TD is high phenotactic probability first syllable stress. And there, again, this is the temporal deviant. It differs from the standard in the stress patterns. So I'd say that this first peak that we see around 200, 300 milliseconds, this is basically the unexpected first syllable stress. So here the stimulus is louder than the previous stimuli. And that's this first kind of peak we see. Then we have a positive peak that's approaching 400 milliseconds. And then basically later, again, more negative peaks. And I think these are then also related to the amplitude envelope of the signal, as well as also, because there's still a mismatch then in the second syllable, because now in this case, the second syllable is unstressed, whereas previously it was stressed. So you could say almost that it's two mismatch negativities. On the one hand, there's the unexpected stress pattern, the unexpected stress on the first syllable, and then the missing stress on the second syllable relative to the standard, of course.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Complex, but okay, yes, okay. And did you average all these together to compute the mismatch negativity in the low and high phonotactic?
So for the low and high phonotactic probability, or in figures 3 and I believe 4 or 5 or one of the other ones.
You may
Finish
your
very briefly, yes.
sentence.
So the statistics are all computed on identical stimuli across conditions. So we're comparing the same stimuli to each other, and then we don't see these big differences as in figure 2. They're much more aligned with each other up until the point of the mismatch negativity.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Katharina Emmendorfer. The time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. And I request that you and your company here present wait here until we are done with our deliberations. Alexandra, Katharina Emmendorfer. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Jansma is authorized to confer upon you the academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. Invite your supervisor to take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times? To be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Alexandra Catherine Emmendorfer, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee and affixed with the beautiful and official seal of our university. Ja, Alex. Dear Dr. Emmendorfer, es ist vollbracht, or as the Americans would say, you made it. Also on behalf of Sonja and Milene, I congratulate you, Domo, and your family to this great scientific achievement today. And also thank very much the chair of the reading committee or members of the reading committee, especially Valeria and Marie from far away. Thank you for joining in, and all members here in the Corona as well for taking good care of you and toasting you today. It is my great honor actually to look back now a bit. I think I have 6 minutes, Peter, you told me, right? So I think we all know you as an excellent research master student already in cognitive neuroscience. So we go back quite a while. And also I remember that I was your mentor there, and we had these coffee chats. I think you had tea this day. I don't know. That's what I didn't remember anymore. And that you always said that you love language a lot. And you actually ended up doing a brilliant master thesis with Milene and Joao on already phonotactic regularities. And I think because of this thesis, Milene said, well, that's a good one. And Sonja said, I think she's a good one. So we collected all our money to actually grab you into a PhD position. And actually what we see today is the product of this. And that's really, really, really something. So basically what we learned today also, you work on phonotactic regularities, but you said, well, that's a bit boring and just simple single dimensions. I would like to add something else, and you added the syllable stress, and you did brilliant work, which is actually published in fundamental research, but you also did that in the transfer to dyslexia and for people with reading problems, and that actually makes it relevant what you do. Don't forget that, never, right? Yeah, we also, I mean, that's also what I think Alex pointed that out. We started to apply this type of question to language production, and that's quite a challenge. So I always try to improve the profile of language production research, but it's really nasty and difficult. And you were so disappointed when you saw, oh, this paradigm was not optimal. That was a bummer. And I promised to not use the word, but I use it. It's cute.
Oh, no.
We simply chose the wrong cue, or there's something going on with the cue, and eventually we should work with Peter in visual perception to understand more what happened during the cue period, because that actually trashed our analysis for like the relevant time period, which is then related to language. So think about your cues, do pilots a lot before you collect the entire data set. But what is strong about you, Alex, you keep outstanding, right? So there was the bummer, but we said that's a strong part. So don't give up. It's not a problem. That's science, right? And of course, when we make mistakes, we get wiser and better. So that was good that there was the wrong cue, right? So, but enough on science today. I think what I would like to spend the next couple of milliseconds is about the person, Alex. So, and actually, I thought I would like to describe this as the ALEX phenomenon. So, A stands for absolute dedicated to the project. You studied always hard, you read a lot, you were well informed all the time in terms of theory, but also in terms of method and in terms of advanced EEG analysis. So you were always there and you worked hard. You spent, I think, sleepless nights in checking the recordings of your subjects. And then I remember that one time you looked very pale. I said, what happened? I had this dream about splicing. Like that means that even during your sleep, you prepared material, which is nasty. And working in language, we all know how nasty it is to work on materials. And you did this in a perfect way and always so positively driving forward. That's an attitude that is so strong. Don't forget that. Yeah. And actually, being in this day and night work in preparing the experiments, it's like watching these waves in analysis for hours and days and weeks and even years sometimes. I really had to laugh when I saw the cover of your PhD thesis, because for me the first association was, oh, that's Alex in an astronaut suit, like floating in space on her brainwaves. And of course, that's also a mental state. And I'm happy because you look happy there. And I thought, okay, that's like the phase of this life is done. And there comes the next phase. And it's very nice. But it also, like, that's the brain state you can have when you do the analysis. And you did this and you survived with an A for AL and X, right? L stands for let's do it anyway. So as already mentioned before, and there was the production problem, but we also had other hiccups. So we had a little pandemic coming along, and then recruiting subjects, not only normal students who actually say, yes, I come to your experiment, you prepare everything, and then they don't show, but also atypical readers. You first have to find them, and then they have to come, you have to collect the data. And during pandemics, I can tell you that's not easy at all. You kept on doing it. And I remember one thing that was related to some American leader called the president. I forgot his name. He's not in chair anymore, but you were very, very concerned about what goes on in your other home country because you're bilingual, right? And yeah, and we always try to like comfort you with that, but you were very dedicated, and that's the L. Let's stand for it anyway. So there's things going on, third factor things in our lives, but yeah, we go and stick to the plan and we go and move on. That's your strength, Alex. E stands for extraordinary, kind, and social. So I really remember, like, first of all, you organized the joint meetings of two labs. You moved the brain and language lab and the band lab together, also in research. We're very grateful for that. You organized all the meetings and you organized the cooking. From you, I learned how to do a vegan lasagna. And still the Jansma table is very tasty because of you. on regular basis. So keep on this. This is extraordinary, magnificent how you are as a person. And the X finally stands for extremely scientific integrity. Yeah, your work in the lab and doing data analysis reflects your view on scientific integrity, I think. I already hear you thinking, so why are you mentioning it? Because this is standard, but that's not standard at all. And you also say, sometimes I'm uncertain. I don't know what the levels are of being integer. I remember that we had discussions how to frame an introduction or to formulate an hypothesis. And but that's exactly what you should keep on doing. It's not a weakness, it's a strength. You have weaknesses, you feel uncertain, you talk to people, you discuss. And based on this discussion, you fire up a joint alignment, and then you manage actually to align 4 ladies' brain waves nicely to actually come to this product. So X for extreme scientific integrity. Keep on doing that. Yeah, and this Alex phenomenon is actually very pleasant to have around. So, and it's not only for science, but also for teaching. I want to stress that Alex was a tutor. Alex supervised capstone empirical work, and the students all loved you. And I'm very happy actually also to learn that you will now keep on doing the supervision. As a postdoc in Nijmegen, you will now supervise PhD students. How beautiful is that? And we are very proud of you. Alex, stay as you are and have great insights further in your future projects. Take good care of yourself, of your cats, Gottes too, of Domo and of your family. All the best. Congratulations, Dr. Alex, from all of us.
Dear Dr. Emmendorfer, I first say something official. On behalf of the Board of Deans, I congratulate you with the honor you have acquired. So I want to also congratulate you in the name of our faculty. I think one thing that is also clear is that we should congratulate not just you, but everybody who surrounds you, that is your family, your large group of friends, many of whom I also see here, and everybody who is close to you. So I think you did this together in a way, and I think so the whole crowd here deserves congratulations also. So congratulations to you and to everybody here present. To everybody here present, I'm going to ask in a minute or so to leave the room and to go independently. Actually, there is the pedal who will guide you towards the refter, where I think there is something nice to be consumed. And in the meantime, if there is a voluntary photographer or two, then they can stay, and we will make some pictures together with our guests on the screen, and the jury, and the paranyms, and yourself, of course, with and without a diploma in whatever configuration you want. So I think with this, I think I have said everything I need to say. I will hereby officially close this session, and I invite you to follow the pedal.